ტელეკომპანია იმედი და პრაიმ შოუ სტუდია წარმოგიდგენთ. გადაცემის პარტნიორია ლისი ტოპოგრაფი. ახალი ჯანსაღი საცხოვრებელი გარემო ყველაზე ახლოს ტბასთან.
ქალბატონო პრეზიდენტო, ჩემთვის ძალიან დიდი პატივია იყოთ ამ ფორმატის სტუმარი და მე დარწმუნებული ვარ ჩვენს მაყურებელს ძალიან საინტერესო დიალოგი ელის გამორჩეული 8 წელი გაქვს თქვენი ქვეყნის წინაშე. პირველი კითხვა მინდა დაგისვათ, კითხვა რომელსაც ჩემს ფორმატში აბსოლუტურად ყველა ადამიანს უსვა, ოღონდ უსვა ბოლოსში, მაგრამ ამ შემთხვევაში გადავწყვიტე, რომ ეს კითხვა იყოს თავში. როგორ თვლით? თავისუფლება რაშია?
It means the ability to take decisions that you consider the best ones that you can take in any given situation. And to accept the consequences. We don't always so easily understand what freedom means or how we can use it. And it turns out that freedom, while it frees you from fetters, it allows you a possibility for action and for movement and for thought, supposedly unlimited. But then you realize that life consists of making choices, of making decisions, and that making decisions can be a burden. Why? Because it's not always obvious. Whether I remember I was 10 years old, and for the first time we were in the refugee camp in Germany, and things started appearing in 1949 because they had a currency reform. Before nothing, shops were empty, there was nothing. All of a sudden there were things. My mother decided she was going to buy a hat for me, took me to a hat shop in Lübeck in North Germany, and allowed me, a 10-year-old, to choose my own hat. And I came down to 2 different hats, wondering which one would look better on me. And I couldn't decide. I didn't know which was better. I asked the sales lady. She says, you choose yourself. I asked my mother. My mother says, you choose yourself. And I thought, I don't know which one will look better on me. So I said, well, pick one. Okay, picked one. That night when I went to bed, I started thinking, maybe the girls in school will not like this hat. And maybe they would have liked the other hat better. And I was lying in my bed and crying out of anxiety because I did not know which was the better choice. And I was given a choice and I found it a fantastic burden. I would have been happier to be told, you take this and then that's it, that is correct. And then you relax and you obey. So that you see, this is a childish example, but I think it is true of things like how to run a country. So that living in freedom means you have to be not just bear the burden of making choices, but you also have to bear the burden of accepting somebody else might not like my choice. Somebody else may not like the way I have decided to live or the values that I have. I had an interesting experience at a ballet festival here in Latvia. Well, as president, I went backstage to congratulate the artists. And So one of the artists introduces me to a very old lady who's there and says, she looks me up and down, looks at me and says, "I don't like your shoes." "Oh," I said, "well, that's too bad." I said, "I'm sorry to hear that, but I find them quite comfortable, thank you very much." And you see, you can never be sure that everybody is going to like your shoes or everybody else is going to like your decisions, but you somehow have to learn to live with them.
არის თუ არა თავისუფალი ადამიანი, ვისაც შესაძლებლობა აქვს, აი თქვენ შემთხვევაში მაგალითად ორივე ქუდი იყიდოს.
Sure, that's one way of solving it. There are many ways of solving things like that. But you see, I think that we are humans, we are social animals. We are more like dogs than cats, you see. And that means that in order to live together, we must have certain rules. And as philosophers from the earliest day of discussing about what freedom means have always pointed out, one person's freedom stops where another person's freedom starts. If I do anything, whatever, that could include criminal behavior, that could include harmful behavior to others, and we have rules in civilization that put limits on the absolute total freedom of choice that a person has. We consider certain things unacceptable. We consider murder unacceptable. We consider it a crime. We consider stealing unacceptable. It's both a sin in the Bible, and we need these rules. And this is what civilization, first in a family, as children are brought up, they are made into social beings. The education of tomorrow should include not just learning to read, to write, arithmetic, computer skills, and everything, learning professions and what have you, civilization, history, the arts and whatnot, but also working together.
გერმანიაში თქვენი ბავშვობის წლები ახსენეთ და მე როგორც მივხვდი, ეს წლები იყო ომის შემდგომი. რანაირად აღმოჩნდით გერმანიაში და როგორი იყო აი ეს წლები, რომელიც მე დარწმუნებული ვარ მარტივი არ იქნებოდა ომის შემდგომი გერმანია.
Well, I was a child refugee, basically, the child of political refugees, and which meant that I was a foreigner or an immigrant or the other for most of my life. And when at the age of 60 I took early retirement from a university in Canada and was offered a job in Latvia as founding the Latvian Institute, I felt that I was coming home to a place where I belonged by birth. Because everywhere else I was sort of tolerated, as opposed to people who were born there and who had certain privileges. Our getting to Germany was fleeing from the Red Army, period, and fleeing from communism. That was my parents. My mother, even as she was trying to explain to her mother while she was leaving, because my grandmother didn't want to leave. They had a farm here in Kurzen, and she
Latvia.
says, south from here. I have my animals and I have my household, and I don't want to leave it all behind. It so happened that the front went back and forth for 9 months over that farm, and everything was destroyed. Everything was destroyed. The animals and the buildings and everything. So my parents left everything behind. My mother put a clean tablecloth on the table and the Bible and some salt like she did on New Year's Eve, and bread. And she washed the curtains and starched them so that she said, either we come back to our home, or the people who will come, the foreigners who will come here, they will say, well, that's at least a civilized family who lived here. She felt a certain housewife's pride in leaving that everything that they, as a young couple, my parents had worked for them. And we kept going west, as it were. 3 days after our leaving Riga, the Red Army took Riga. It kept advancing. We went to Liepāja, which is on the west coast here in Kurzem, and it was encircled, and there was less and less food all the time. And these ships that were taking German troops away, and tanks and whatever, and war equipment, would take a certain number of civilians as well, who were fleeing from communism, and many of them were torpedoed by the Russians. And so that, again, my grandmother was very worried about, it was a very risky trip. On New Year's Eve, or if you like, on the early morning, January 1st, 1945, my parents got on one of the last boats that left successfully with civilians. I saw the end of the war. And then in Germany, as we kept moving west, we kept experiencing more and more intense bombings. But before that, we had to pass through a transit camp that had, I think, been used for Russian prisoners of war, because it didn't have beds or cots, but it had sort of shelves. It had some 3-story beds, but it also had shelves along the walls and straw on it. And the straw was dirty, and it was full of lice, of fleas, and of bed bugs. And I discovered as a child that I'm allergic to all these insects, you see, and they kept biting me and so on. And all children are under the age of 7, a doctor told me, who was in that camp, happened that they passed away, and so did my little sister. Passed away within a week. She died of pneumonia, because there was no medical care, there was no aspirin, nothing whatever, and no kind of help. And the rest of the family, we got ill as well, and we actually simply, my dad managed to cut a hole in a fence around, and we simply walked out in the early morning and walked to the closest train station. And everything was in chaos in Germany at that time. And we took a train to the nearest city, and then my dad went over to the city hall and said, "We're refugees. I can do any kind of job," and they gave him a job. They didn't. Whereas the people who remained in the camp, I later found out from the memoirs of somebody, they had been sent back east to dig ditches for the oncoming Soviet tanks. And naturally, they were taken over by the Red Army, and they were shipped back to Latvia. He was just a boy at the time, so he survived, and he wrote his memoirs about that camp and so on. We kept moving west until the border between East and West Germany. And then there we lived partly in Latvian refugee camps, where I started to go to this very improvised school. But we also, well, it's too complicated to explain, but my mother worked for the British, and therefore we at times were given an apartment or a room that was requisitioned from the Germans somewhere in the city, in the town. So I not only, as a child, who by then was, I turned 8 years old by the time we went to Lübeck, I was growing up and being socialized or integrated into Latvian society. I mean, I only knew my family and my relatives. So I started going to school and started learning, what it means to be a Latvian and what Latvians are like and that sort of thing. Because everybody is very worried about their identity. We must keep our identity, we must keep our language and so on. But at the same time, I had contact with the Germans. I was playing with German children. I learned to speak German. I tried to borrow books in German if I could, because I was thirsty for reading, and there weren't books around very much. And so I already, as a child, I realized that the way the Latvians looked at things and the way the Germans looked at things were really quite different. I saw all of that as very early. And of course, then going to Canada as a multicultural country where multiculturalism was a policy was an experience. And the conclusion I took from that is that I wanted to be treated as a human being, not somebody with a hyphen, foreigner, immigrant, refugee, new Canadian. I did not want to have labels pinned on me, but to simply be accepted, face to face, as a person to a person. I met a little girl I wanted to play with, so I play with a little girl. I met a boy, and I play with a boy. And if I wanted to be accepted as a person, then of course I should not myself be, of course, dismissive of others, the same, they're not as good as I am, and I will not play with them.
ასევე ძალიან დიდი მადლობა მინდა საამაყო პარტნიორებს უთხრა ჩვენსაც, რომელიც არის კრედო ბანკი და City, რომლებიც ჩემთან ერთად არიან მთელი ამ ხნის განმავლობაში და ძალიან ბევრ რაღაცაში მეხმარებიან. როდესაც გახთით ქვეყნის პირველი პირი, რა გამოწვევები იყო მთავარი და ამასთან ერთად რამდენად დიდი წინააღმდეგობა იყო რუსეთიდან, თუნდაც მაშინ, როდესაც ლატვია ხდებოდა ევროკავშირის წევრი და ნატოს წევრი ქვეყანა.
Oh, Russia was not happy at all. No, they made it quite clear. In fact, it was worse than that. Russia really had already a black PR going on against the Baltic countries as being a bunch of Nazis. And this is why, to me, it's so extraordinary.
იგივე დღეს რაც უკრაინაზე ხდება.
Exactly. And when I heard Putin accuse the Ukrainians of being Nazis, I thought, well, they haven't invented anything new since Stalin's time. It's the same thing. You can kill people, you can persecute them, you can take away their rights, you can deport them to Siberia by declaring them that they're fascists. Latvians were, I remember when I was president, there was an employee of the Chancery, a chauffeur, who said in the place where he worked in Soviet times, he had a lot of co-workers who were Russians who would get very annoyed if they ever heard him talk Latvian with another co-worker, because they considered that this was now the Soviet Union and everybody should be speaking Russian, and that he should not be speaking his language of the dogs, but speak human, which meant to speak Russian, and that if they got really mad at him and said, you damn fascists whom we did not get around to shooting you yet. And when we regained our independence, then they picked up the old narrative that Latvians had been very active in the Holocaust. Now I see again that I've seen programs on the internet, how many Jews had been killed in Ukraine or in Poland. So Eastern Europeans are responsible for a large part of the Holocaust. One doesn't mention the Germans. It's as if the Germans never had to do a thing with it. It's true, they brought, for instance, Dutch Jews were brought to Latvia and to be killed here on our soil, you see. And yes, we did have collaborators, and my first job was to tell everybody, if you can find a collaborator who has not been shot yet, because most of the collaborators were shot by the Russians when they came, we have laws, they have no, if you like, limit on them. You find us somebody whom we should put to trial, and Latvia will do them immediately, because we consider war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, absolutely, it is in our criminal code. So that was the first battle. And the second thing was language. The parliament had accepted a law that made it a requirement to use Latvian more in the public sphere, but to some extent it also said that companies should use Latvian also in their correspondence. The OSCE said that was going too far. And this law was signed by Parliament, accepted by Parliament, as I was elected. And the president in Latvia has veto powers over bills, passed by Parliament. But at the time, 7 days in which to evaluate the bill and send it back to Parliament, explaining why they wish to have certain things reconsidered and which things. And then the Parliament looks at it again, and it can either follow or not follow what the President asks. I was given just as I was taking office, and I didn't have my own. I was not in a political party. I didn't have a team. I was all alone, and I had 7 days to evaluate this bill about the language law, and I had signals from the OSCE and from Finland, which at the time, second half of 1999, was presiding in the European Union. And I was told concretely by the Finnish president, in December, the European Union is going to decide what new countries to accept as candidate countries, as candidates. Latvia had presented its desire to be candidate in 1995. But we are now in 1999, 4 years later. Estonia has already been accepted as a candidate. Lithuania and Latvia have not. And Latvia is being told, with the language bill that your parliament has just passed, which intrudes too much into the private sphere of citizens with a language requirement, you will never be accepted as a candidate country to start negotiations with the European Union, whereas the other countries didn't have any visible sort of barriers. So I had, fortunately, both the lawyer that my predecessor had as a legal advisor and some others, the legal advisor of the parliament and other experts from a legal point of view, came on Saturday and Sunday after my election, sitting there in shorts, in the heat of July, drafting why we were returning this law from a legal point of view, and I could explain them from a point of view of my knowledge of bilingualism. Montreal was a bilingual city, whereas the province of Quebec is a monolingual. A monolingual province in a bilingual country, which is Canada, you see? Very complicated. Yeah. We sent the bill back within the 7 days, and Parliament, I told them, if you do not change that bill, we will not be invited as candidate countries in the European Union, and you will be doing enormous harm to the future of our country, and I will be going across the country and telling everybody what a bad choice they have made in electing you as deputies, So the deputies actually listened to my arguments and rewrote the bill in a way that was acceptable to OSCE and to the European Union. And so Latvia was accepted as a candidate country 6 months later at the summit in Helsinki.
იმ პარალელის შემდეგ, რაც ახლა ნაციზმზე ვახსენებთ, ის ბრალდებები რუსეთისგან, რომელიც ჯერ ლატვიაზე მოდიოდა და დღეს უკრაინაზეა, მინდა ამ პარალელის შემდეგ ასეთი კითხვა დაგისვათ. ვიცი, რომ შენახვედრი ხართ პუტინს. მე არ გეკითხებით დაახასიათოთ ის, რასაც დღეს ჩადის ეს გასაგებია იმ ტირანიაზე და მართლა რომ ფაშიზმზე, რაც დღეს უკრაინაში ხდება. დაახასიათეთ აი იმ პირველადი შთაბეჭდილებით, როგორიც აი მაშინ დაგვრჩათ მას.
Well, the first thing I found out about him, he's a liar. Which normally when you meet somebody at the diplomatic level, you have confidence in them. You assume that what they say corresponds to reality, right? We had an interesting first meeting in the sense that as the new president was elected, first selected by Yeltsin and then actually elected in the month of May, many people in Latvia said, oh, this is the occasion we can improve our relations with Russia. He said, of course. And they said, oh, how are you going to do it? You don't even speak Russian. And I said, that's no problem. The new president speaks German. After all, he was a spy in Germany, and he was taught German. I happened to learn it as a refugee child when I was in Germany, so we can communicate in German and directly. Well, now the foreign ministry sends this signal to the Kremlin and receives a rather cold answer saying that the political climate is not quite right for any exchange of official visits at this time. And we're wondering, well, just
cloudy.
what the climate could be, but well, too bad. No, so we made our gesture of goodwill. They gave their answer. We were busy, believe you me, we were busy diplomatically with lobbying our interests with the European Union and with Canada and the United States for NATO and for the European Union for both, for most countries, or the neutral ones, of course, for the European Union. Well, now, one day a signal comes, a mysterious signal comes through mysterious channels directly from the Kremlin to Riga Castle to the president. An invitation to have an informal meeting between the two presidents on neutral ground, since the political climate is not ripe or propitious for official exchange of visits. They could meet privately, informally, in a friendly manner, over, for instance, a dinner, but on neutral ground. Interestingly enough, President Putin was at that time, and the date you'd have to look up, but I don't know it by heart. It was early on in his presidency. He was in Austria with his wife and two daughters to ski in a ski resort, but also to buy 3 warplanes from Austria, from the Austrian government. So neutral as the Austrians are, I found out that they are not above selling quite the sort of arms that NATO now says they cannot sell give to Ukraine. Well, Austria was selling them to Russia in those days.
So strange.
Yes, isn't it? I found that a bit strange. And the idea was, therefore, I should come alone. Well, of course, the president doesn't go alone. Well, I could have one security person with me. And we would have this, no documents, no official agenda. And I said, fine. Obviously, I could not go alone. I took the head of my chancery with me. I took my official Russian interpreter with me, because for the official, after all, the discussion could not be private, I felt, between two presidents like that, just getting acquainted. And I also asked for the deputy foreign minister to come along, because I did not want to be accused of making deals with a neighbor of doubtful friendliness towards Latvia. So that was agreed, and we arrive in a village which is absolutely bursting full, because President Putin has 117 security men have taken up all the hotel rooms in the village, and so on. And we were supposed to have dinner together, but it turns out the dinner was cancelled. We would meet just, across a table. We enter the room, there's a table and 2 chairs on both sides. And in walks President Putin with his, also I think 3 people at his side, including his translator from Latvian to Russian and vice versa. And a pile of documents like so. And he plunks them on the table and says, well, here we have all the complaints that Russia has against Latvia about the way it's treating its fellow citizens in Latvia. And my first reaction was, the man who's sitting in front of me is a liar. First of all, one thing I must remember, that he's a liar. He said no documents. Here are his documents like that. Well, I exaggerated.
Dinner?
They were only this big, poetic exaggeration. They were only this big. And he starts going through our Russians who are not citizens of Latvia, they are not permitted to participate in elections. I said, jolly right, they're not permitted. They're not citizens. They should apply for citizenship and then they can vote in elections. But it's humiliating to have to apply for citizenship. I said, why should it be humiliating? Well, because they've been living all their lives in Latvia. I said, but they've been living there with an army 80,000 plus strong as an occupying force. And that's not a free Latvia. We are now in a free Latvia, and our laws are different. But you have to speak Latvian. I said, yes. And in Soviet times, you had to speak Russian. And he says that this is unfair to the Russophones. I said, President Putin, everybody in Latvia is a Russian speaker, except the president. But everybody who grew up here in Soviet times was a Russian speaker. So when you talk about defending your Russian speakers here in Latvia, I'm sorry to say that they are not yours to defend. They are mine to defend. Because they are, and even the ethnic Russians that we have living in Latvia, they're not your Russians, they're my Russians.
What did he say?
He looked very surprised. He had not expected that. But to this day, he's talking, I mean, the same rhetoric. Do you see what I mean?
I know.
Exactly the same thing. The Ukrainians are harming the Russian speakers or the ethnic Russians in Donbass and Luhansk.
ელოდებოდით თუ არა, რომ ომი დაიწყებოდა უკრაინაში?
No, I really did not, because I didn't see a reason. Why should he? Well, I must confess to one foolish thing. In 2008, the first part of the year, France was the presiding country of the European Union. I got an invitation from the Élysée to write a chapter on European security, as I saw it, from our point of view and our experience, in a book that was being published about Europe. And in that book, in my chapter in that book, I have this one sentence. Now that we are living in a Europe that is now reunited and democratic and free, and when we no longer have to fear of having tanks coming across our borders and invading our territories, we can now look forward to a better future, and so on and so on. The book came out in July 2008, and in August 2008, the tanks rolled across the borders of Georgia. And now, of course, they're rolling all over Ukraine. That naive hope, I think I shared with just about every European, alive at that time. It was already proven wrong a month later. But I think Europe did not wake up enough and not soon enough as to what it meant for the future of security and peace in Europe and in the world.
მე წავიკითხე სხვა შორის თქვენ ინტერვიუს, სადაც თქვენ ამბობთ, რომ 2008 წელში, როდესაც საქართველოში შემოიჭრა რუსული ჯარი პუტინის მეთაურობით, ჩვენ უბრალოდ აღშფოთით, თქვით, რომ უბედური ქართველები რაც უდღეში არიან და პრაქტიკულად გამოვიდა, რომ დავხუჭეთ თვალები. რატო გააკეთა მაშინ ესე ევროპამ, როგორ ფიქრობთ?
Well, forgive me for being cynical, and I hope my fellow European Union citizen will forgive me for being blunt about this. But I think that part of Europe that was on the free side of the Iron Curtain became very comfortable with this state of affairs. In other words, France was liberated, Belgium was liberated, the Netherlands was liberated, Norway was liberated, Denmark was liberated, Britain won the war, and everybody was very happy about the end of the Second World War. And then the Marshall Plan came to Germany, and the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic blossoming of Germany, they accepted. They were fellow fighters against Nazism. This is why the Russians, they play like a violin, We won the fight against Nazism. The Russian sacrifices are the ones that defeated Nazism. And it's very interesting. Europe can get very upset about what is happening in their former colonies, what can be happening thousands of miles away. But what happens behind the former Iron Curtain, I've noticed that there's a certain, for so long it didn't exist in their consciousness, It was a blank. There was a blank. And I think that they have a difficulty in identifying and feeling empathy with people from that part of the world. They really, and I'm sorry if my European fellow citizens get offended, but that's the way I am afraid that they have a shortage of empathy, saying, oh well, that's Russian sphere of influence. And I have heard German politicians actually tell me in so many words that Russia has a right to take an interest in the countries around it, the periphery of its borders. It's a big country, it's got nuclear arms, and it has a right, in other words, to determine to do what it wants with this area. And this idea of spheres of influence is not dead. And then they say, oh, but the Americans had the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, forgive me, but Monroe Doctrine dates from the 19th century. We are in the 21st century now. It's really outdated.
Ჩვენი მმართველობის პერიოდში ბალტიისპირეთის ქვეყნებმა ჯერ კიდევ 2000-იანი წლების დასაწყისში მიიღეს ევროკავშირის წევრობა, გახდნენ ნატოს წევრი ქვეყნები. რაც ჩვენ შემთხვევაში გახდა ძალიან რთული. ზოგადად რამდენად ლოიალურია ნატო ისეთი ქვეყნებისთვის, როგორებიც არის საქართველო, უკრაინა, მოლდოვა. რატო ვერ ხერხდება მთელი ამ ხნის განმავლობაში გაწევრიანება?
There are two different reasons. But I remember when I first met President Kuchma of Ukraine in September 1999, shortly after I was elected. He had a conference in Crimea. And he explained to me at the time that Ukraine had such strong economic and other ties with Russia, and also ethnic and many intermarriages and so on. And of course, the eastern parts of, historically, there were more Russian speakers in the eastern part of Ukraine than the western because of the partition of Poland and so on. That he thought that too close a rapprochement, getting closer to the European Union, was not a good idea for Ukraine, and that most Ukrainians were quite happy to keep close relationships with Russia, and they didn't want to make Russia unhappy. I think in Georgia it was a bit different. You had stronger popular support for the NATO. One of the things that NATO was looking for in accepting new members, first of all, it wasn't sure it wanted to enlarge at all. My job as a president was not just to lobby for my country. In my really intense work with the Americans, and I do mean intense, I first of all explained to them that NATO should enlarge, period. No. The fear of having to fight for your freedom is what kept them back. But what that means is that they envisaged those countries that voted against giving a membership action plan to Ukraine and to Georgia at the Bucharest summit in 2008.
Yes.
I think they gave us, personally, that's entirely my personal feeling, not as a former president, but as a person. They gave the go-ahead to Putin. They said, go ahead. We are not, We do not want to give them a membership action plan because it will look like we are ready to defend them. But we are not ready to defend them. But if we, the West, are not ready to defend these two countries, well then, Mr. Putin, you are free to do what you please. And here is Mr. Putin first rampaging across Georgia and taking 20% of its territory. And then some years later, he rampages and he takes Crimea. And then he puts in his army in the Donbass and at least a third of Donbass and Lugansk. And now he's rampaging and murdering and wiping out Ukrainian cities because the West had said, we do not want to defend them. And NATO is saying, we do not want to defend Ukraine. They're very scared of being involved in a direct confrontation as NATO. So they're sending, each country is sending aid as a country. Great Britain is, France is, Latvia is, Estonia is, everything we have, we are sending to them to help them.
Georgia.
But as countries and so on. And thank you for that you're doing yourselves being under danger, you are helping them. And we don't have huge stocks of armaments either, but we are sending them to Ukraine because obviously they need it more. And it's a sad thing. I mean, it's a sad world because there was not this desire to defend these countries. And obviously, if they were afraid of having to defend you, that means that they had in their heads already the possibility that, unlike my naive hope that Russia would never do it, that Russia just might attack them. And it has.
როგორც ადამიანი, რომელიც ძალიან კარგად ერკვევა იმაში, რაც ამ სამყაროში ხდება. რით დამთავრდება ეს ყველაფერი? განურჩევლად იმისა, რომ რა თქმა უნდა ჩვენ ყველას გვინდა, რომ სამართალმა იზეიმოს, რაც იმას ნიშნავს, რომ უკრაინამ გაიმარჯვოს.
Well, first, about the outcome of the war. I think Ukraine needs more help. It needs anti-aircraft equipment. And I don't understand, personally, I do not understand where it is written that the red line is sending so much equipment, but no more. Because it's going to annoy Russia. And if we annoy Putin, he's going to push the red button and we'll have a nuclear war. Listen to what Putin is saying today. He sounds like a madman already. He's not in contact with reality. He reproaches all sorts of things to the Ukrainians which they have never done. He lies about his intentions. So what is the basis for not giving better arms to Ukraine so they can defend themselves better? They are the bravest people in the world who are ready to die for their country. They need decent arms to counter this huge military. And unless this is given to them, the West, I consider, the West will be complicit in the crimes being committed, the crimes against humanity being committed in Ukraine today. Because if you see somebody being strangled, raped, killed, with their arms up, and then shot as a civilian in front of your eyes, and you do nothing about it, then you are not just a bystander, but I feel you are complicit in the crime. And that is going to go down into European history and into American history. And I don't know how future generations will look back on this period and how they will evaluate the generations and the leaders today in power and the decisions they took.
თქვენ ხედავთ, რომ ჩვენ დიალოგს ამშვენებს ასევე ორი სასმისი და ეს ნაწილია ყოველთვის ჩემი გადაცემის, ჩვენ ქართველებს გვჩვევია განსაკუთრებული ტრადიცია ღვინის და სადღეგრძელოების თქმის. მე არ შეგაწყენთ და აი ამ ბოლო ნოტაზე მინდა რომ დავლიო თქვენთან ერთად სწორედ რომ თავისუფლების დამოუკიდებლობის სადღეგრძელო რომელიც ყოველთვის სჭირდებოდა და სჭირდება ჩვენ ქვეყნებს. დღეს ჩვენ ცოტა უფრო მტკივნეულად გვაქვს ეგ საკითხი და იმედია მალე დარეგულირდება.
To the future of Georgia and a free and happy Georgia.
Free and happy in our friendship with Latvia.
Absolutely, always.
Thank you.
Very nice. Very nice.
Our partner is the wine factory Vazis Kalami, and it's the same red wine named Kinsmarauli, and I want to.
Looks lovely. Looks lovely.
უღრმესი მადლობა ასეთი ინტერვიუსთვის, ასეთი მიდგომისთვის ზოგადად საკუთარი ქვეყნის მიმართ, უკეთესი მომავლის მიმართ და მე თქვენ ქვეყანას განსაკუთრებით და ყველა იმ ადამიანს, იმ ქვეყანას, ვინცაც უყვარს ვაირა ვīķe-Freiberga, ქალბატონი პრეზიდენტი, უსურვებ დიდხანს ყოფნას თქვენი ქვეყნის საგულშემატკივროდ, თქვენი ქვეყნის სამსახურში და რა თქმა უნდა ჯანმრთელობას. თავისუფალ და მშვიდობიან ქვეყნებში გვეცხოვროს.
But you know one thing we haven't done. I think we should drink a toast to the freedom of Ukraine.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
I think so.
Yes.
May they be free again.
გაუმარჯოს თავისუფალ უკრაინას და უსურვოთ მალე გამარჯვება.
გადაცემის პარტნიორია ლისი ტოპოგრაფი. ახალი ჯანსაღი საცხოვრებელი გარემო ყველაზე ახლოს ტბასთან.